All right, well, let's get started. I think a lot of y'all are here, and I want to recap a little bit of what we've been doing. Um, we're in the final stages. It's almost, there's some rock and roll songs, the final countdown. We launched a rocket a couple of weekends ago now, and you think about the countdown and the excitement to lift off, and I don't know that there's an excitement. There could be. You could be excited that we're about to end this class. So you might be there. You might be halfway bittersweet, because as classes end and time moves forward, maybe we're getting closer to things that would be a normal place that include more being together and those kinds of things. But we're in the final weeks of class. Excuse me. In a lot of ways, it's hard to imagine how quick it's gone, but also it feels like forever ago that we started this class. It feels like a long time that we began this whole thing about Christian community. And I wanted to kind of bring some things forward that we've talked about. I try to do a little bit of recap and pulling forward things that we've talked about to kind of keep it together. We've gone a lot of different places, and that's one of the good things about the Bible is that there is no shortage of material to apply to things like Christian community, because everything that we learn about in the Bible seems to also not only include us, but include community because of the importance of what community is in the eyes of God. We talked a lot about at the start what community really was in the beginning of Luke, where he outlines a lot of the things about the woe-tos and the blessed are's and just the entirety of where everyone was at, kind of in a similar place of belief and importance, not of status or anything else, because they were obviously very different, but it was kind of levelized everything out when it came to the believers that we talked about in Luke. We've talked about the commitment that God wants from us, and how Jesus says that we're useless if we put our hands on the plow and look backwards to the kingdom of God. We've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about idols and the lover of strange things, and how important it is to love the strange, love the odd, love the peculiar. We also talked about an intense love, an over-enthusiastic love that Paul talked about too, when it came to a church that was strong in their faith and that he was encouraging them and were great in what they did, that they almost had so much of a self-importance that it was becoming a problem. And we talked a lot about Christian identity. We've also talked about some very heavy things about us in a singular manner, about sin, about our addiction to sin and how hard it is because of when sin takes root. When those things that are in our heart really take root, the fruit that we bear, the not good fruit, of course, is hard to pull out in those roots that it is. We talked about sin as self-sanctification and how sometimes sin can help us kind of self-save or self-importance of what we do as believers, and realizing that sin as self-sanctification really isn't a good place to be. And a lot of things that we've talked about, I've tried to use a lot of biblical examples and bring out stories and things within the gospel that apply to us. And so I want to, as we begin this week, I want to talk a little bit about the study this week. Now it's about fear and rebellion of God. And I want to go over that because it's important that I do this, because there's so much going on, and I've heard from so many at our church, in our family. We've seen a lot of things that are going on in the world around us. There's been so much that's been going on for the last several months. And so many things have given us a lot of concern. And a lot of that has been legitimate concerns. A lot of it has been things that have been a challenge to us in our own minds about what we understand or what's going on. And I can tell you with 100% honesty that today's class wasn't on the list to do. But it was something that came along in some things that I study and work on every day, every week, that I wanted to do because I felt the strength of it was powerful. The things that we have seen going on for several months around us at times have been nothing less than downright scary. And they've been scary to all of us in different ways. the challenge with coronavirus, COVID-19, what does it mean with, quote, underlying conditions, things that we were learning, things that we were hearing. There's still challenges with it, to be honest. My home state of Arkansas is having a lot of challenges with cases just going through the roof. And so this virus, this thing that we don't know how it would affect us, it has laid to bear a lot of things in all of us, maybe that we're not entirely happy about, maybe things that we didn't think were there. And then we have a lot of challenges that we've had over the last several weeks that in a similar manner that have brought up a lot of things in our minds and our hearts that maybe perhaps we thought weren't there, or that we knew were there and we thought had gone away. And so a lot of what I want to talk about today is about fear and faith as it relates to the community of faith. Because it's important that we remember, and throughout this entire study, the reason I wanted to do this for some time, for well over a year, is that community is a place not only of accountability, but of support and love and care. Community, the church, God's church, his church that he established in the early first century, was a community of believers because God knew that we needed that support. He knew that that was important. This wasn't a faith that would be accomplished in a singular manner. This wasn't a faith that would be accomplished just by someone living a good life. Because as I've said many, many times, if all we needed was the 10 Commandments, we would still just have the 10 Commandments if we could follow them. If we could just be fine and believe in God's grace and Jesus Christ, he wouldn't have sent the Holy Spirit to give us a helper, an interceder, someone to be there for us, to advocate for us, to help us. And lastly, of course, if we could do it on our own with all those things, then the assembly, the church, the body, all these stories that we see throughout the entire Bible, community of faith, community, believers, wouldn't be important. But it is. It's incredibly important. And so I lean into this study today with that preamble because there's been a lot of fear in our minds and our hearts the last many weeks, all of us. And it's not indicative of just the last several weeks or the last several months. We all have challenges with fear in our minds and our hearts about all sorts of things. And so I want you to hopefully hear today's lesson in a way that is centered around the gospel and how God looks at fear and how we need to look at our faith when it comes to the community of believers. So as we go to our next slide, I want to bring up some of the things, and I want to set the stage for you guys. And I want to put this in your mind, and I hope that you'll think about it as we, no pun intended there when I had the word thinking, as we go through this study. Fear is the absence of thinking. When we think about fear, sometimes we think about something that's irrational, or it's conceptual, or it's something that's out there. Now, what I don't want to conflate is fear of something that's very real and tangible. If you have a car speeding at you, I'm not saying that you should stop and think about that car and what it might do to you. If you have someone that's wanting to do you harm, I'm not saying you should stop and think, well, is he really going to hurt me? I'm talking about the fear that kind of resides in our hearts about things. The fear that we make up. The fear that is something that causes us to go into a cycle of thinking about what if, or, maybe, or I don't know. And it kind of grabs a hold of us, that emotion, like we talked about several weeks ago, that those emotions grab a hold of us, and that fear becomes something that doesn't allow us to think. It just is emotional and causes us to react. So I want that to be sort of a guide for us all as we think about this, that faith is about thinking through God's word. It's thinking through his promises. It's thinking through, reading through, praying through. And so we're going to talk more about what fear does to community. These are some of the things that we're going to go over today. We're going to look at parts of Revelation and Numbers 14. We're going to talk about the division among the community of faith. And if you've heard me say it once, you've heard me say it many, many times, that fear is really a symptom. It's the wrapping paper around the idols in our heart. Now, as we look at Revelation 21, I want to read part of that to you. You say, Revelation, what in the world are you talking about? But in Revelation, at the end, In verse 8, it's talking about kind of the end, and he who sits on the throne, the Alpha and the Omega, he who overcomes will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But in verse 8, this is something where he talks about the second death. But for the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and immoral persons and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. It's an eternal place. And it's interesting that in Revelation, you would think that, all sorts of things would be included in that. All sorts of, again, I talked about it several weeks ago and it's kind of come up. We have probably, sins or things in our minds and our hearts about people and things that they've done. You would think that, there's murderers, that's great, immoral. What about thieves? What about this? What about, immoral? Well, Jonah, those are the categories. But it's interesting that when he begins in verse 8, but for the cowardly and unbelieving, theirs is that fire that burns, and that is the second death. Now, the door of death is hard for all of us to think about. And so when we think about fear, I don't know that anybody's excited about dying. I don't know that anyone's isn't. Sometimes we think that, or have heard, or we know folks who've suffered that we're happy to go on because of pain and suffering. Fear is not or rather death is not something I think that any of us should be excited about, because it's the greatest unknown. I mean, unless we've known someone who's died and come back, which would be Jesus Christ, of course. For us, what does it feel like? So that's a hard pill to swallow when it comes to dying. But the way he puts it, it's almost the final part about the cowardly and the unbelieving, the uncourageous, and those who aren't believers. And so that's the second death, an eternal death. But I want to go back to Numbers 14, because that's the important part. That's the story that we're going to focus on in today's class. And the division among the community of faith that it created was substantial. Now, we've had a lot of things that we can go back to and read through that Paul has written about, that Peter's written about, everybody's written about, everybody's talked about it. Division among a community of believers. We know that there are those who hid money and weren't giving it, and when they were asked about it, they lied about it, and they were killed immediately. Things that affected the community of faith badly have never been smiled, never been cheered or celebrated. In fact, they've been roundly rejected in a big time way. And early on, we see what the community of faith dealt with when it came to division and God's anger about that rebellion. So as we go to the next slide, it's important to see that this wasn't something that was new. And so that second death that we see, that we're going to talk about in Numbers, and we're going to talk about, of course, reference here in Revelation, we have to ask ourselves as we get going, as we start at the end, but go back to some of the beginning, why would fear and unbelieving be something worthy of judgment for an eternity? So these are questions that I want you to think about as we go through. It's important, I think, always to look at is, what is the word trying to tell us? What is the word speaking to? What is it trying to help me see? How is it piercing my heart and my mind? And so that second death, that's a final death. That's it. Of course, the wages of sin are death, right? We have to die. We can't avoid that. But the second death, an eternal place of a fire burning with brimstone. But fear is the absence of thinking. And so I want to look really what fear is. It's the absence of thinking, and it's something that controls us. Fear, irrational fear, can paralyze you. It can absolutely throttle anything that you do. Now, I'm not saying that you should be ashamed of that, or that we should, look at that and say, well, Jonah, you don't understand. There's a lot I don't understand. There's a lot of your circumstances that I don't know. And so I don't want to come across as trying to tell you something, that wagging my finger and saying, you shouldn't do this. We all do it. We all have it. We've had it. I've had it. You've had it. You'll have it more. I'll have it more. Things come up. Things happen. And fear is something that really can control us. But then we have to take a step back and realize and recognize it's really not the fear. It's not that irrational thing in our minds. That's not what's really getting to us. Fear isn't the thing. Fear is what's wrapped around something far more significant. And we've talked about idols, and we've talked about things that are in our hearts. But those are the things that we take our rest on, that we are centered around those things. And I'll tell you now, and I'll probably come back to it later, that if our hearts and everything else are wrapped around and enamored with and totally cloaked and covered in God's love, then we really have nothing to fear at all, don't we? In fact, it's our faith and our hope of eternal life that we're going to have, and that no matter what, we'll share a home one day in heaven for eternity, not like the second death for those that are fearful and not courageous. But it's wrapped around something more significant. Our fear is just the symptom that is something far greater. As we go to the next slide. So we go to what that is, and this is what we're going to try and find out. This is what we're going to try and read through. And in Numbers 14, we see what is the preamble, the beginning, the start of what would eventually become the 40 years in the desert that they had to endure. And now I remember this story. You might remember this a little bit. It's the spies, and they go check things out. And the imagery I think that I remember from Sunday school are the men with the pole and these giant, huge thing of grapes. And it said they had to carry it between the two of them. They were so big. And at the beginning of Numbers 14, the Lord spoke to Moses, and it was simple. It was almost as concise as the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy mind, with all thy strength. And he said to Moses, send these men and go to Canaan, and you will overtake it. I'm summarizing. It was, go, do it. That's it. Not Moses, I want you to think about. Moses, I want you to figure out who might be good. He told him exactly what to do. He said, go, and it will be yours. Now, what's great about this, and I've said this so many times, is that we get these opportunities within the Word to see this direct conversation, the direct interaction that God has with his people. And he said to him, go and do, it will be yours. And they carried back those grapes, and the land was amazing, and they talked about it. And they said, what they saw was amazing. They saw the land of milk and honey. They saw this amazing, beautiful place. It was, I imagine, there's a wonderful, beautiful Christian song. I can only imagine. And I think about it sometimes, and a lot of times in stories like this. I can only imagine what those spies saw. God said it will be yours. With what they reported back, it was one of the most amazing places they'd ever seen. And as they brought the grapes back, I can imagine, you're driving in between two men. It was either these grapes the size of your fist or something, but my goodness gracious. And they said that it was the land of milk and honey. And then all the spies, there's many of them. So it wasn't just one, there was a whole lot of them. Sounds like I'm beleaguering the point. It's the word of God talks about this amazing place. But as they came back, as they reported back, some said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are too strong for us. And they talked about the people that were there. Now, there's some big folks. When you read about it, you see that there's some really good-sized people that they were going to have to go after. And I can see, and this is where, you identify. One of the things we talked about was, relationships and generosity was identifying with people, right? Remember that, and the generosity and how important it was that we come from a place of forgiveness. And so I think about these spies, and it's like, yeah, I totally get it. You see these really monstrous people, big old folks. They were twice the size of us, and we can't do this. We are not able to go up against them. They're too strong. They're going to beat us back. They're going to whoop us. And they talked about it, and they talked about it, and they talked about it. And it's almost like the old adage that they talk about it in business and they talk about it in retail. It's one of those long time standing deals. When somebody talks bad about your business or they start complaining, that's a far greater challenge to overcome than when you get a bad reputation or a company is not doing well with something. People talk more bad than they do good. And that's a testament to human nature, is that there are so many things and so many challenges in our lives that the bad and the evil and the nastiness that comes out of our mouths is hard to control. And these men started talking about all the problems and all the things, and it scared everybody. In fact, they were so scared that they started weeping, and they were afraid. And what we see is that the commandment of God, what he said, go and take this land. It will be yours. God. I mean, and this is where you almost want to say, you're looking back, you're reading this going, what's wrong with these people? What's wrong with them? God said it's going to be yours. He's going to hand it over. You're going to be, I'm on your side. Be strong. I mean, the song I've been thinking a lot this week. Be strong and courageous and do not be afraid. The Lord goes with you each and every day. And these, where they had God speaking directly to them. And what we have from this is the story of Joshua and Caleb. Now, Joshua and Caleb were two of the spies that went along. And if you remember the story, and I had to read it, I had to go back and look at it. You look at it, and those two were the ones that didn't give in and didn't succumb to fear. They didn't buy into the, oh, we can, or we should be afraid. And the fear spread amongst that whole community of faith. So much that they were weeping, gnashing of teeth, crying. We're dying. This is the end. And they had God tell them that he would deliver it to them. So Joshua and Caleb, what do? They go before the congregation, it says, and they tear their clothes. And they start speaking to them, and they start talking about all these things. And it's an amazing testament. Let me pull it up here. It's an amazing part where they stood out. And they spoke very passionately. Now, what happened afterwards, I'm sorry, I'm trying to find it. There's a great part of the story I was reading. So what they did is they said, let's appoint a leader and return to Egypt. And they just, they were giving up. You heard the phrase, cut bait and go home. I mean, we're going back. We're going back to Egypt where things hadn't been that pleasant. And they were going to go back. I mean, they weren't just afraid. They were totally in retreat mode. These folks were, again, God's chosen people from the start. They were going back. We're going to go back to Egypt. Let's get somebody else and we're going back. This is crazy. And you see how the fear just spread like wildfire. You see how all these things went so fast. And it says, Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, of those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, and they spoke to all the congregation of the sons of Israel, saying, the land which we passed through to spy out is exceedingly good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. And here it is. Listen. Only do not rebel against the Lord and do not fear the people of the land, for they will be our prey. Do not rebel against the Lord and do not be afraid. The significance of that can't be understated. I wish I could underline it, bold it, 110-point font. Because it's so significant that Caleb speaks out to them and says, your rebellion against God equals your fear. They will be our prey. We will be the winners. We will be the victors. And this wasn't just, hey, he wasn't just talking, saying, hey guys, listen. They tore their clothes. I mean, the whole symbolism here, the spectacle that they put on, imagine what, I realize this maybe he's kind of odd, but let's say Mike, sometimes Mike, when he's up front, gets passionate and he gets loud and we're listening. Imagine him just ripping off his tie, pulling open his shirt almost like Superman. We would all just stop. The kids, my children would totally watch that. But I mean, imagine what that would be. That's what Caleb was doing. They tore their clothes. Do not rebel and be afraid. But all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Then the glory of the Lord appeared in the tent to all the sons of Israel. Not only were Joshua and Caleb trying to tell them to not be afraid and rebel, the fear was so deeply rooted in the hearts of everyone else that they were going to kill him. They were going to kill him. And that's how powerful fear and the rebellion against God was, that they were going to perish. Now, what happened to those who were afraid? The anger was palpable, and some of them tried to make up for it because of their guilt. Well, I guess we did something wrong. I guess we should go down there. But their fate was not very good. Their rebellion, you see, wasn't met well by guilt. They didn't. You have to ask yourself, were they really thinking? Again, fear. There's some of them started to be afraid immediately. They weren't thinking through. I would like to think. Now, I don't know that I would do this, but I want to submit this to you that maybe I would and maybe you would. That if God said to me, Jonah, that's going to be your land. It will be yours and you will be victorious. I think I would be a little bit confident in that. I'm being completely honest here. I really think that I would feel good about that situation. There's times that I pray about things right now and I don't get that direct connection with God that they had. I see it through his word, of course, but they had it through Moses. And he said, go. The Lord said this will be ours. And they go to try to make up for it. Oh, well, okay. And because what God does is he comes down and, man, he is angry. And you have to say, well, you know what? You can't blame him because he was on their side. They will be your prey. And you had Caleb and Joshua, the entire 12 spies that went out, 2 who were saying, this isn't good. They're trying to stop it. They were trying to stop them. We don't have it in the word, but let's play a little bit of what if. What if they did that and folks turned around and said, no, you're right. Okay, here we go. You know, doubt and concern, those are human behaviors. Those are human challenges. Those with our minds as we work through. Sometimes maybe you've been fearful and things have kind of come around and you work through it and you get out of that fear and you have greater confidence because of your faith. But these folks were so entrenched in their fear that they were going to cut bait and go home, go back to Egypt. But they were also going to kill these guys. They were so entrenched. Their fear had overtaken them. And again, it wasn't just the fear that they were going to be stoned. But God interceded. And he came in and he talked and he in the way that God does and the way Moses and Aaron, they just begged and begged. They didn't mean it. They didn't mean it. And so they tried to make up for what they did. They tried to make up for their fear. But see, it wasn't just the fear. And when they went and they were warned, don't do it. Don't do it. They were not protected by God. They were struck and they were beaten down. Some probably perished. But that was the lesson that they had to learn. Now we know what happened after. God said that Caleb and Joshua were going to be taken care of. They were rewarded for their faith, their courage. Because in their own belief, they went and did and listened and obeyed. And when everyone else was just in panic mode and melting down and we're getting out of here, we're going to appoint new leaders, the fear had overrun them. The fear. And again, these were big people. These were big dudes. These were big folks. I mean, this was a land that was of such significant substance and joy, the milk and honey. I mean, the imagery was significant. That I'm not saying, again, that you have to look at that and identify and say, man, I've been in a place like that. I get it. And to say that Caleb and Joshua probably didn't have pangs of fear or anxiety and hearts racing and beads of sweat on their foreheads. I mean, okay. But they were courageous because God was with them. And he said, I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to deliver them to you. You are mine. You are my chosen. You will be victorious.
Hey, Jonah?
Yeah.
I think another significant part of this is that they just came out of Egypt. God just brought them out of Egypt.
That's right.
Okay? The same type of promise, that they had relied on to get where they were was the one that they were rejecting.
Yeah.
God had told them before that he would deliver them. He provided a deliverer. There they were, again, relying on God's promises. And here they were rejecting them, wanting to go back right where they were before they were delivered.
Yeah.
So it was significant in that sense that they were now in effect, rejecting God.
Yeah.
And he had done, even though it was plain on their face what he was doing. It's kind
Yeah.
of like the same thing that, happened in Jesus's day when he's performing all these miracles and it's clear who this guy is, and yet and still, Pharisees, teachers of the law are rejecting him, even though it's plain who he is.
Yeah.
And this kind of fear is sort of lack of faithfulness. When God himself makes it clear to you about, the power of his promises and the certainty of his promises, and you reject it, that's lack of faithfulness fear.
It is. I mean,
that kind of thing, I think stands in contrast to, what I call legitimate fear. Jesus goes out, is tested by the devil, and devil says, "Okay, jump off the temple." Jesus is like, "You're crazy." And there's scripture that says, don't put your God to the test. And so there's a distinction between that type of fear, which is, legitimate fear, where you have a concern about something, and lack of faithfulness fear.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Yeah.
And what's significant too about all this is that not everyone in the community of faith was fearful. And we see where God says, my servants Caleb and Joshua, they're going to be blessed, and they were. He rewarded them for their courage. Their courage in some ways was standing up to their own family, their own kind, and saying, don't do this. This isn't right. And he rewarded them, and everyone else was levied quite a punishment. And it's like Oliver said, I mean, they were going back to a place that they'd been delivered from. And because of that fear and that grumbling and just the lengths that they were going to, those idols in their heart, what was it they were holding on to? It was their own security. We're self-satisfied. There are any number of things probably. We're smarter. This is crazy. We're not doing this. We're fine without that. Here God, his chosen people, was giving them the land of milk and honey. He was giving them such an amazing reward. It's the significance and the power of God's love that he was giving them something of such amazing abundance. And they were just saying, nope, we don't want it. Because to them, they had a better idea. To them, they had something else that they wanted that was better. To them, they had a whole different concept of what that should be. And in this instance, like Oliver just said, was going back to a place, literally going back to a place that they had been delivered from that really wasn't that great. And that idea that the idols, the things in their heart, that fear and that grumbling really was a much deeper, much bigger, much more problematic thing. And God knew exactly what it was. And he said, because of this, because of your distrust and your fear and all these things, because you didn't listen to me, because I was going to give you this, because I was going to give you something so amazing, because I love you so much. And I realize a lot of those are my words, but when you read through that part of Numbers, he says, for every person that was in this group, here's your punishment. And it amounted to 40 years wandering in the desert. And so as we go to the next slide, and I'm going to try to wrap up because I know that we start a little bit late. The thing that was important when we think about fear is not thinking. Fear is the absence of thinking. Caleb and Joshua really thought through this situation, and you have to give them a lot of credit. Not only did they think through it, they remained steadfast in their faith, in their belief that when Moses told them, God said for us to go do this and it would be ours. So I want you to go spy. I want you to go figure out what's going on and come back and report back. Their faith was strong. And again, they probably had some anxiety. They probably had some shots of, oh boy, here we go. But deep down, as they thought through it, again, these are my words and my inference. As they thought through it and they realized, hey, wait a second, everybody. Don't be afraid. Do not be fearful and rebel. Do not rebel against God. And as people wanted to kill them and God stepped in, they were blessed. Joshua and Caleb were blessed immensely. But those who were fearful and this is important, this is about the community of faith. This is what's important. Those who were fearful and made the others grumble, and bad and negative and want to stone them, they were punished severely, significantly. 40 years wandering, 40 years. So not only were those who had the fear, but they infected that entire community of faith with that same fear. And they all, for those who didn't stand up, they were all subject to that. Now, it says the congregation, it says the group of people. Was every single, Israelite, was every single person fearful? Probably not. Some may have not just entirely known. Children, I mean, you think through it all, there's some things that you can kind of arrive at. But on the whole, they all suffered for the fear because they all bought into it. They all succumbed to that fear and distrust and that rebellion. The next slide.
Hey, Jonah.
Yes.
Just to add on what Oliver said earlier, their unfaithfulness and the fear, because of the fear that they had looking back where they came from in Egypt, and also if they go forward to receive the promised land. So the fear is based on one thing, which is we are going to die.
Yeah.
What they have forgotten is, even if they wanted to go back to Egypt, they have forgotten that they were dying in Egypt too. And their death in Egypt is being suffering as a slave and then being killed by Pharaoh for no reason. But if they go forward, hanging on the promise of God, having faith, just like Caleb and Joshua, even if they die, they're going to be with God.
Yeah.
So sometimes the fear that we carry makes us look back and take us back to what we know, but the result might be the same.
Yeah.
And so it is a human nature. We often like to hang on to something we already know, but the Bible clearly tells us that faith is something that we have not seen, believing in that. And that's what they seem to be missing about Caleb's and Joshua's faithfulness and the people not having that faith. And rightly so in the New Testament. And even when you apply it to our life now, we often look back and we say, I wish, if I have been, I wish if I have done, but we tend to look at in the rear view mirror, which is smaller than the front mirror, which is the windshield. Yeah. And it's just becomes to be deeply in our fearfulness, tending to miss and to lose that confidence on the Lord, whatever may be. As long as we are with the Lord, just like what Joshua and Caleb said, that we would be all right. Yeah. The road might be tough. Things might be rough. But as long as we're with the Lord, even if we die, we're going to be all right.
So I want to say this as we wrap up. And we started a little bit late, and I apologize if we went a bit long. And so if anybody's late to church, the elders can blame me. But here's what I think is important in this. And Hoptu and Oliver said great things. One of the most important things I would add to what I've said is that there can be a rational fear at times. And Oliver pointed to that even with some of the things. There are rational concerns that have come up the last several months. We've had a virus that has plagued a lot of folks. A lot of folks have died. We know by extension, some folks at church who've had it. And it's a very real concern. I mean, death is a scary thing. It's not anything that again, I don't think any of us want to die, but we know the wages of sin are death. We also know that this world isn't without suffering. This world is not without suffering. It's not without pain. We can read about that in every story there is of Job. I mean, look at Christ. Christ suffered not only on the cross, but at times he languished over just what he knew he had to do. Suffering is a part of our human condition. The challenges that we have, the suffering that we endure, are making us better for something that God has in store that's even more. A land of milk and honey. And I'm not talking about just an eternal home of streets paved with gold and all those wonderful things we sung and think about. But that land that he was delivering them to was right there. It was on earth. He was giving them something so wonderful. But why? And this maybe get lost. Sometimes we wrap, the sin and all this stuff around it. But make no mistake, the question as to why they were getting that was because God loved them so incredibly much. And he loves you, and he loves me, and he loves all of us so incredibly much. And he asks us to be strong, courageous, and faithful, no rebellion. And we get better, and we grow, and we're stronger. And if God is for us, who's against us? I mean, if we transplant some of the New Testament guys back to that group, back to that time, God's for us, who can be against us? Caleb was kind of saying that. Don't be afraid and rebel. But life has its suffering. Life has its challenges. You've had some. I've had some. We've all had some. But fear and rebellion has no place in God's mind, because he loves you so stinking much that he will take care of you. He will take care of all of us. And it's important that we remember that yes, this world is broken, and there's suffering, and there's pain, and there's hurt right now, and so many things. And God never tells us that won't be the case. He never says that you'll be absent of that. He never says that when you believe in me, it's all roses and all wonderful, and I'll give you everything you ever want. That's never in the promises of God. That's not a story that comes out of the gospel. What he says is that I will always take care of you, and my plan is greater for you than you realize. A future that I have for you is so amazing that I want you to trust me. I want you to love me, to keep all my commandments. And I have a future and a glory for you in store that you have no idea how great it's going to be. And in this story, we see that Caleb and Joshua hung true to that. They stayed true. They hung tight. They tried to tell them, and they were taken care of. And we see that those who didn't met a different fate. And that's what we need to take away from that, not only as a community, but as individuals in these times that are so challenging and so hard and press us and make our minds and create fear and uncertainty, that we remain true to God's word, that we spend time and we remember his love, his unbelievable love, and the land of milk and honey, and what he wants to give us for our faith, for our courage, for what we do. I want to end it now. I could keep talking about the good and the gloriness of God,